Good evening, everybody. It is really nice to welcome you here, despite the rain, and that also this panel being the last panel in the foreign ministry section of the Opinion Festival. I hope there are going to be many remarks also from the audience, because I can assure you we have an excellent panel set up here. Just to introduce quickly myself, my name is Minna-Liina Lind, and I'm the Undersecretary for Global Affairs in the Estonian Foreign Ministry. I've been in this position for a year now, but I've been dealing with the UN issues for almost all of my 20 years in the Foreign Ministry. It is the topics to how to make this world a better place. As banal as it sounds, this is also the name of the panel, Making the World Fit for Freedom. So we have excellent people who have traveled here. We have Ambassador of Colombia, Asa Chater, who has then traveled from Warsaw, where he covers also Estonia, and has many more countries actually to also cover, so I'm sure he can talk about it. Then we have Ambassador David Donahue, who is now in Brussels think tank called ODI, but has been serving in the Irish diplomatic service for a very extensive period of time. And also I met him and admired him at the UN when I was posted there. Then we also have our almost 10-year foreign minister, Urmas Paet, who I also had the pleasure of working with as the spokesperson for a lot of this time. And he's currently in the third term in the European Parliament. And then last but not least, of course, we have our own also foreign ministry colleague Ingrid Ammer, who is our current ambassador in Egypt. So just to set the tone for this discussion we are going to have here. I mean, we have a lot of global crises. We have humanitarian crises. We have, of course, the ongoing aggression of Russia against Ukraine, but, you know, the situation in Gaza, in many other parts of the world. And I think for Estonia, ever since 2022, most prominently, but also way before that, from 2014, but also from 2008, after Russia's attack in Georgia, we have been talking about the fact that when we have a permanent member of the Security Council, that being Russia, who is not upholding the peace and security he's supposed to do everything to do in this world, is there anything that the international community and also the small countries or big countries and medium-sized countries can do to make sure that this impunity doesn't spread? Because we see this impunity elsewhere. We see this in some African countries. We see this also in Latin America with Venezuela and the developments there. And we see it also in Asia. So we are thinking that is there a way of still fixing the Security Council so it would be fit for purpose? And when we hear about a lot of criticism about the United Nations, it's always directed towards the Security Council, that it's not able to prevent atrocities. But the UN does a lot of great things. When we think of all the vaccination, all the food help it gives in the world, it is tremendous work. So I don't know, for me it's not fair to be that critical, but I'm sure there is room for improvement. And Estonia was also for the first time in the Security Council in 2020, 2021, and then we actually for the first time also realized more so that, you know, we first and have to listen to other countries with their problems, because I think the empathy became more prominent in Estonia's foreign politics, because we saw that there are countries who come and they have their own problems and reasons there. So we have to listen first to them and then maybe talk about what we are worried about. So I think to warm up this, I would like to pose questions to Ambassador Donahue and Ambassador Chater to ask, what do you think is the public perception of the UN in Ireland? Let's start with you, David.
Okay, Minna, and many, many thanks for inviting me here. I recognize the Irish weather, so I feel at home. The UN is going through a particular crisis of legitimacy right now for all the reasons you mentioned. The problem about impunity, of course, is not only that Russia appears to be getting away with things as a permanent member of the Security Council, not committed to peace and security, but frankly, we also have the reverse situation with the US, which in effect is protecting Israel from similar allegations that could be made against Israel. So the impunity works in all directions. Some of you may have heard of a proposal made by France a few years ago, which tried to address the question of the veto. The whole problem is that Russia will use its veto to prevent any serious action being taken against itself or its allies. The US will do the same. France proposed that the 5 permanent members would commit not to use the veto when it was a question of mass atrocity. That if there was a resolution being discussed in the Security Council involving mass atrocities, that there would be a voluntary decision not to use the veto. However, the US was not going to support that. Russia and China were absolutely not going to support that. Britain, from my own memory, was on the fence a bit. In theory, yes, but in practice, they were worried about the US. France, you could argue cynically, knew that this proposal was not going to fly, and it did get a fair amount of credit, but it perhaps knows that it will never fly. But that is still a possible way forward, that the 5 members would voluntarily agree not to use the veto in certain cases. A second big problem is the representativeness of the members of the Security Council, that basically 2/3 of the work of the Security Council involves Africa, and Africa is seriously underrepresented on the Security Council. There are various other proposals made to try and reflect 21st century realities in the membership. And we've been discussing this for the last 20 years. We'll probably discuss it for another 20 years because nobody can agree or nobody wants to agree on what a new model might be. My last point, Minna, if I may, is to say that it's terrific that Estonia and countries like Estonia, even including my own, can get onto the Security Council from time to time in order to try to make the larger members more accountable in order to remind them of their duties. Estonia did a very, very good job. I know that Colombia would, in a similar situation, also hold the larger members to account. That is one reason why we have to make sure that smaller members will always be able to get on. One risk about bringing on other new big members is that it would squeeze the space for the smaller members. I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you, David. I'm sure we will dig into some of these issues also, and also of the probability of changing anything, which I think is one of the biggest questions. So the same question that I just posed to David, please to you, I said, if you would describe how in Colombia the people are feeling or thinking about the UN, since actually it is one of the good examples also in relation to the Security Council.
First of all, thank you very much, for this invitation, and I want to also congratulate to the organizer of this great event, because I think we need more of these affairs, kind of bringing these topics, these matters, to these open public discussions, and take them these topics out from the sometimes boring rooms of our ministries. In relation with the subject, yes, sometimes people feel that the United Nations is not doing enough, is not working, or probably lack of legitimacy to addressing the problems we have. We have to understand also that the world is not static, and politics and diplomacy is not static. It's a dynamic thing. So organizations that probably 70 years or 60 years or 40 years ago were useful and help to overcome the difficulties probably today are not working for the new world or new, let's say, balance of power. So we have to, of course, check what is not functioning. Colombia from the beginning has been very critical on the veto possibility for the permanent members, but also we claim for more representation for smaller or medium countries, and definitely more representation, regional representation for geographical, say, representation. This is a discussion that has been for a long time, probably from the beginning and the reform of the Security Council, and will go on. But I think that our challenge is also to try to show the big players on this that these reforms that will bring legitimacy to the international order will benefit not only small or medium countries, but the whole community.
Yes, thank you very much. Of course, the question is then how we make these 5 permanent members to change anything, because the power they have received in 1945, then that being, as you already had mentioned, besides Russia and the US, UK, France, and China, it is what everybody is talking about at the UN. And as said, for Estonia, of course, the veto power and the veto initiative overall, we criticize everybody who uses it when it's the case of mass atrocities and crimes against humanity. But when we think of this, and you totally understand us here being in Estonia, when we have the neighbor of Russia, then we have to think of it that when there is somebody who has caused all these problems is trying to be part of the solution, it doesn't just add up. But I know that I have had with previous foreign minister and my dear friend Urmas actually this discussion before. What is the perception in Estonia about the UN? And maybe if you want to add the first words from your view.
I guess the strongest side of the UN is that there is no real alternative in the world, so that it's still the only organization where all countries are there. Plus, of course, some practical issues. You also mentioned assistance to refugees, assistance to children in war zones, and so on and so on. But when we speak about, how to say, peak politics, peak global politics, then here, well, I'm rather very pessimistic, because I really don't think that 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council actually will be able and ready to give something away. Plus, of course, if you look at the all biggest conflicts in the world these days, be it Russian aggression against Ukraine, be it ongoing and even deepening conflict in the Middle East, be it another permanent member of the UN, China, and Chinese aggressive behavior used to be against Hong Kong, now it's against Taiwan, also some other ambitions globally. And UN as such actually is playing no real role in any of those real conflicts or solving of these conflicts which exist today. And of course, it is also huge damage for the United Nations as such, because, well, societies and people, they see that UN is unable to propose, not even talking about implementation, but even to propose any adequate solutions for those real huge crises in today's world. So that in this sense, yes, I don't actually see any bright perspective for this, because obviously we entered, I guess, around 10 years ago in the world into the new phase where this conflict between authoritarian regimes and democracies is deeper and deeper. Because, well, the same war in Ukraine or also Chinese ambitions or some other conflicts it's not just local or regional conflict, but they are the signs and samples how the value systems in the world are more and more confronting. And that's why I guess this deadlock in the Security Council of the UN will continue, as long as there is in the larger picture the same conflict between authoritarian and democratic regimes. So that in this regard, I guess that there will be more and more power and need for power concentrated into the concrete regional organizations. So that here in Europe, in the European Union, we speak about strategic autonomy. Of course, part of the need for this is also that the international legal system is weak, and we don't see any help coming from this international legal system and rule of law, when the same permanent members of the United Nations, they themselves start and organize wars and conflicts. So that, in this regard, all what concerns this part of the functioning of the United Nations and the international legal framework, then yes, I'm rather, I guess, pessimistic, but it also means realistic.
Thank you. So, Ingrid, we are moving now to Egypt, where you are. Before, maybe in the next round, we will comment on the fact how successful the European Union or its member states have been in delivering messages to our global friends and partners. I also wanted to hear from you, how do you see in Egypt, but also in the region, people viewing the UN? Because as also Urmas said, there is actually no alternative. And for many, the UN is the place to go and the place to be, and you have one vote and you can, exert it in a way. So for many, it is still, besides, African Union, many other also regional organizations, this is still the global organization.
Thank you, Minna. Yes, I'm now for 2 years already in Egypt and covering also several other Arab countries. And if you look at the map of the world and see where Egypt is, then you actually see that Egypt is surrounded by conflicts from all sides. So to the west, it's Libya. It's a never-ending story. To the south, it's Sudan. There is a deepening crisis and civil war going on, and there is no real perspective of finding any solutions because two generals just fight for power, okay? And then the war in Gaza. And of course, for them and for the whole Middle East, actually, this is practically all they are talking about and all they are seeing. And you would see in the streets a lot of protests and empathy also for Palestinians and especially for children of Gaza. You see it everywhere because people breathe it and feel it. And with this also there is a lot of criticism. Yes, partly it's UN also because whatever we manage to adopt, be it resolutions, but nothing is implemented. So yes, UN is doing a lot of good things. You mentioned, and I agree totally. So nothing we cannot say that it's all bad. But if we see the conflicts, armed conflicts of the world, then the Security Council is not able to do practically anything. And so the problem is in implementation. And yes, there is a lot of criticism towards UN, but also towards partners in the West.
Yes, thank you. I will come to the criticism of partners towards West now, and maybe again, David, I would start with you because you've also spent, I said, a lot of time in the Irish Foreign Ministry and being ambassador. Also, some of it in Moscow. Not from the global partner sense, but at the UN, you were also in the middle of all these discussions. And I would like to see how you think the European Union and its member states have done when we hear about these criticisms that we only go to these countries when there is a problem, when we need something from them, when we have asked, and we do not engage with them enough in the meantime?
Well, strangely enough, the UN is one place where the European Union actually has less of a profile than elsewhere in the world, because there's a very strong emphasis at the UN on each member state, and there's a wariness about regional formations. So the EU is struggling to actually create a profile for itself at the UN. And put it another way, an individual EU member state like Estonia or Ireland can punch above its weight at the UN, but the EU as a formation has difficulty because developing countries don't particularly want to see the EU as an extra force. So that's just really one point. But I think at the UN, the very fact that every member state of the UN has the same value, that is actually, it's very important in terms of ensuring that each country has a voice, that it can actually contribute to world affairs, and even if it is not on the Security Council, it has the possibility of doing that in the General Assemblies. The General Assembly really is the one area of the UN where things can be done. And let me pick as an example the negotiations with which I was involved myself on sustainable development goals, the 17 sustainable development goals. Every country in the world signed up to those in 2015, and strangely enough, despite all the crises, the conflicts, and Ingrid referred to several in Africa, despite all of those problems, the world is still committed to what the General Assembly agreed in 2015. Now, I'm personally surprised at that. I thought by now people would say those goals were too ambitious and so on, but that's one example of how multilateral diplomacy still works. Far from saying we should get rid of those goals, the world is actually even more enthusiastic about them. The pandemic really was one reason why the SDGs, as they're called, were given greater emphasis. The feeling was after the pandemic we had to rebuild the world, and these goals around sustainability were the way to do it. Another issue is, of course, the Paris Agreement on climate. It wasn't negotiated at the UN as such, but it still is a kind of a UN creation. Again, it's going through difficulty, but everybody agrees that the Paris Agreement is the only way to go. There are other examples of big global agreements which are still valid and which were generated by the General Assembly. So I suppose after the earlier somewhat pessimistic view around the Security Council, I just wanted to add to what others were saying about the good things that can be done by the UN and which are always a source of surprise to me. I keep on expecting that people would give up. When the more conservative governments began to appear in, for example, Hungary and Poland, but also in Brazil and most of all in the US, there was a general despair a few years ago, a feeling that multilateralism is over, but I actually don't share that despair. I think the UN still can do a lot of really important things among the 193 member states. That's distinct from the Security Council.
It's very true. I mean, the General Assembly has the power, and we are also now looking into ways how we could have more of it exerted. So it's good to hear that you're saying that multilateralism is not dead, as some of friends and colleagues also have expressed at the UN. So, Urmas, how does it look from your side, having been the foreign minister, but now also having had many of these election observing missions all over the world? How is the EU perceived in the world?
Well, good question. Next, please. Could be, I guess, the adequate answer to this. Well, it is, in this sense, long story because there are lots of details and very controversial details. Because on the one hand, of course, EU has huge potential to be very powerful in the world. If we look at the size of European markets and how attractive it is for everybody in the world, if we look at the, well, amount of people, and they are the, well, richest people in the world, all in all, and so on and so on. But the problem is that EU is not as powerful it could be. You mentioned UN and EU's role in the UN. Well, we all know that for any foreign and security policy decision made by EU, there is need for consensus. It means that all 27 should agree. And there are even in the UN lots of cases where EU is unable to present its position because there is no consensus among EU member states. And that's why also others in the UN look at the EU that, well, you are there, but you even don't have position here and there. The same what we practice, unfortunately, here in Europe and Brussels, now assisting Ukraine and influencing Russia, where Hungary is much too often against or is not joining consensus. The same we see, for instance, also in the UN, because there are also all the member states should agree whatever EU presents in UN. So this is actually a growing problem, that the need for consensus in every and each foreign policy decision is actually weakening the European Union. Second element is that, well, the logic says that all instruments in foreign policy should go hand in hand. I mean here classical diplomacy, foreign trade issues, development cooperation, but of course also, well, defense and military side. But with European Union, there are two problems. One is that still this military or defense cooperation is very weak. And second is that all these four elements, they are still not working together. So that, for instance, if now during last 2.5 years, the issue number one in European security policy has been Russian aggression against Ukraine and how to stop this and how to assist Ukraine, how to influence Russia to stop this aggression, then at the same time, if we look, for instance, at development cooperation, well, it's like day and night in this sense that development cooperation and the goals there and partners there didn't much change during this couple of years. I was in Ethiopia a few months ago, and it was another vote in the United Nations General Assembly about well, war in Ukraine. And if I correctly remember, then Ethiopia abstained. And then I was there, I asked them, Secretary of State of Foreign Affairs of Ethiopia, that, well, you are very proud that European Union is the bigger donor for you in Ethiopia. And now, when we have actually one very big and existential problem for European security, then you just, well, don't vote, or, which is even worse, sometimes you vote how Russians want you to vote. So what's the issue? And the answer was, I guess, in this sense important that you can actually multiply this answer, I guess, to most of, for instance, African countries. They said that, well, this money which flows in from European Union, we even don't discuss because it's for granted. This money comes anyway. We even don't discuss that we have to do something because of this European support. But at the same time, we want now buy 14 military jets from Russia to bomb our opposition in northern part of Ethiopia and to fix the deal. Of course, we vote how Russians want us to vote to get these 14 military aircrafts. So that in this regard, I guess that Europe has been too long too naive. Just a few years ago, there was very ambitious EU-Africa policy plan. I would say it is completely failed these days. If you look what's going on in sub-Saharan Africa. I guess this morning, Swedish ambassador was expelled from Mali, for instance, and so on. Well, Russia is directly there, at least in 12 African countries, which most of them used to be also big development cooperation partners for the European Union. So that here are so many very concrete examples how development cooperation of the European Union, huge amount of European taxpayers' money, has actually not creating any influence at all from EU's well, political perspective. Or when we speak about trade, as I said, lots of countries want to get better and better conditions to enter into European markets. But how much this has also been taken into account when we speak about European real, well, foreign policy and value interests in the world. Plus then, of course, the same European defense cooperation, which is still very weak, but well, in global arena, the fact is that it is very influential. So that when we look, I'm not even talking about Middle East and European Union's influence over there. But if you look at our eastern neighborhood, conflict or war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. You remember a year ago or a bit more when there was new active phase of war, then the foreign ministers of Armenia and Azerbaijan traveled several times to Moscow, several times to Washington, and 0 times to Brussels. And Armenia and Azerbaijan are the most important Eastern Partnership, partners. But again, they said directly, well, you have no boots or troops on the ground, you have no military influence in the area, there is waste of time to talk to you. So that, well, I stop here, but
we will
there
continue.
are some other issues.
No, I just actually wanted to have one follow-up question to this development cooperation part. Is that then that the EU should be more transactional in a way, and also sometimes cut off some of the funding in case there are human rights abuses or any other such cases? So maybe you quickly respond.
Short answer is yes.
Yeah.
Because again, when we look at the concrete examples, 2008, when Russia attacked Georgia, and you remember then Russia called that, well, world should recognize Southern Ossetia and Abkhazia as independent countries. And then, of course, most of the countries in the world, including European Union, said, no, it is the violation of international law. Don't do this. Don't recognize South Ossetia and Abkhazia because they are not really independent. They just occupied Russian territories. Well, most of countries didn't recognize. But still, for instance, Nicaragua did. And after this decision made by Nicaragua to recognize South Ossetia and Abkhazia, 2 weeks later, EU sent another few $100 million as development cooperation money to Nicaragua. So, well, what is the reading?
Sometimes they say this is the long plan, and if you cut it off, worse things might happen. I'm just explaining.
We see in Mali and Burkina Faso and Niger and lots of other places how it works. Yes,
that is good too. Then I will come to you because then you can respond to all of it. But first I will go to Ingrid to also kind of make the circle of the EU members in this panel and then hear your views also on it. So how do you see it? I mean, how well has the EU, its member states, overall, maybe the West, has been able to engage the global partners? And as was said, whether sometimes we should be more demanding, would that work better?
Thank you, Minna. It's actually $1 million question because we cannot, put an equation mark to all global, partners. We have very many, very different countries. I'm right now posted to the Middle East, and I see more what's happening in there. And well, with Egypt, we have now strategic partnerships, so big plans, and we are going to have strategic partnership also with Jordan. So actually, EU has understood that we also need the partners in the south. But if you ask me how we are perceived, then yes, one thing is doing business. This we are very good in, and if we manage, and there is very big interest, but politically. We are not seen really strong because I think most of the countries don't really understand how we function. And especially I mentioned before also the war in Gaza and all the cacophony that came out of European countries, different messages. People just did not understand. And this is, yes, one of our problems because, our image, it weakens our image because when we can't really talk in one voice, we are not seen as a strong partner.
Thank you. So, Asad, the only outside of the EU member in this panel. How do you think in Latin America or in Colombia more precisely the EU is viewed? Because actually at the UN we are sharing many of the same goals with the European Union, and the West is sharing many of the same goals with Latin American countries. So overall the view is very, very similar, but still, I mean, some of our problems might also seem a little bit far away there. So please.
Yes, a few words, if you allow me, just to, I want to describe what David mentioned about positive, let's say, outcomes of UN, because there are. No, it's not the fact that we have some critics of the functioning of the Security Council and in general the United Nations. It doesn't mean that it doesn't work. And also, as Urmas mentioned it, there's not alternative to it. But be careful. We need anyway to straighten, make stronger the legitimacy of the UN. And it means also that when the Security Council or even the UN made some decisions or pronunciations on any situation around the world, we cannot just stress it or criticize the veto when it's not convenient to my politics, because anyway, it's only to use the UN to support my point of view or your point of view if you have the stress to do that. So I think one of the huge challenge of the Security Council and the UN in general is how to tackle the real problems and situations in the world in the most objective way. And not just according to a specific interest. You were mentioning about the mass crimes in the world. Yes, and I mean we agree. Probably no country would use the veto just to escape from that situation. But who is going to? Who is the judge to say if in a specific situation there is or there is not a genocide, for example, crime? So that's a problem which we have to tackle. Now, that's the legitimacy. Also important to straighten it, and coming to Latin America again. People need to, and the countries need to see that UN and the Security Council works for everybody. If the Security Council lose legitimacy and the United Nations lose legitimacy, regional organizations on new organizations like BRICS, etc., so eventually, gain and gain more power of decision.
Thank you. So before I will shortly explain also this making the world fit for freedom concept, which the title here is. David, how would you comment what Urmas was also saying about this development cooperation versus,
Well, if you forgive me, Urmas, I agree with most of what you said, but I'm not sure I would entirely go along with the transactional approach to development cooperation as far as the EU is concerned. I suppose the EU tries to maintain a values-based foreign policy. It tries to do that, not always successfully. So, but in accordance with EU values, we should be trying to address poverty and disadvantage in its own terms, and it should not be something to be bargained with against decisions that individual developing countries might take. Now, I do fully accept that, say from an Estonian perspective, the many developing countries would have been doing Moscow's bidding in the line that they took on Ukraine. But another point of view would be that they saw this as an intra-European issue or intra-global North issue. Now, I'm not saying I agree with that, but it was the explanation I heard. So I suppose it's difficult to be exactly sure why developing countries would have responded on Ukraine the way they did. I do agree that human rights is a dimension that Europe needs in its relations with developing countries, with partners there. Why do I believe that? Because that is in turn part of the value-driven foreign policy. That, in fact, if anything, it lands us in trouble because China famously has no interest in human rights, and China will secure all kinds of influence and leverage in, say, Africa, because it isn't imposing human rights perspectives, but we are, because that's part of kind of an EU-driven approach. You're absolutely right when you talk about coherence between different policies, and if you like, I know that's a principle that we all subscribe to, yet I realise what I've just said means a lack of coherence. What your argument is that Europe, to be coherent, should be basically requiring that its developing country partners would act in a certain way which is in line with Europe's interests. My own feeling is Europe has to hold on to some sense of values, because that is what characterises Europe. But you know, there isn't a huge difference between us. But I used to be in charge of Ireland's development cooperation programme, and the idea that we would make it subject to how particular partners would vote at the UN, that's where I would slightly part company.
Thanks. Any comment? No. I will just briefly now explain also this.
Well, there is comment.
Oh, please.
I sorry, but I simply can't see you now. Sun finally is on me again. You know.
You're still with us.
Just one short example comment. I was half a year ago with the electoral observation mission in Zimbabwe. And again, Europe and European Union was very proud that we supported, I don't remember exact number, but it was 4 or 5 million euros to teach local Zimbabwe electoral observers, because Zimbabwe government wanted it. And Europe proudly paid the bill. And when the elections happened, then second night after elections, Zimbabwe police arrested all local electoral observation mission members, because they, simply tried to do what Europeans teach them to do. So I was in the same hotel, and one floor up in the middle of night, Zimbabwe police came in and arrested all of them. I hope they released you. Some are still missing, you know. So that, and in this sense that, of course, now after it happened, everybody is very clever that, well, why we spent this 4 million, it was obvious from the beginning and so on. But partly they are right. Because on the ground, there was simply very obvious that Zimbabwe president and government, they have no intention to have any fair elections in this regard. And of course, unfortunately, we have. And we also can look at the protocols of the Court of Auditors of the European Union, how much, you know, European development assistance has been misused and so on and so on. So that I still think that unfortunately also too many examples which are simply also against the same value system and human rights, whatever Europe wants to deliver with these money checks as well. So that I think that actually basically this field needs huge analysis, but not just analysis, but also real reforms.
That is a good introduction to this concept of making the world fit for freedom, which we have now in Estonian foreign politics. And it is actually stemming from the fact that we are admitting that we have done some things wrong, at least Estonia. Maybe we should have also been more in the listening mode and less in the telling of our problems mode. And here I think it's a very good example. I was a few weeks ago in Antigua and Barbuda. It is a very small island state in the Caribbean, also of course being hugely affected by the climate crisis. And I met there a colleague from Nepal. I had also, I know her from previous times at the United Nations. And she was saying, you know, Nepal, a small country, clearly not a small country compared to Estonia, but between China and India. And they are saying, you know, we just want to have a prosperous life, do, you know, our own things here. But the whole whole everyday life is about balancing and also making these decisions, how not to upset anybody with something. So what we also have then entailed in this Fit for Freedom is that Estonia has actually gained so much from the freedoms. We lived without the freedoms for quite a while. They were taken away from us. So we are now enjoying them fully, and we think they are also good to have. Estonia is number 6 in the press freedom index and number 2 in internet freedom. We are currently chairing with Germany the Media Freedom Coalition, and from next year we are going to chair the Freedom Online Coalition. So we're going to spread this, and we are fully confident that the countries where the human rights of the people are not respected are also the ones who do not agree or who do not uphold their international agreements. So we are coming from the fact that, as you said, you know, the human rights perspective, it is a very important part of it. Of course, how do you spread it, and how you can make sure that this authoritarian versus democratic regimes, how you can make sure that people's rights are actually respected. And the third part, how are actually the people able to make their voices heard? Because also the civil society didn't really exist here for quite a long time, or at least, you know, you couldn't really say anything. And in many countries, it is still the case. So I think this opinion festival is one of the greatest examples of this coming together. Everybody can say, you know, it's full freedom of expression here. But many countries is not the case. So it's also how it is that the civil society could be better heard, and how small countries, as was talked about also in the beginning, would have any say in the international affairs. You know, you also, David pointed out, we have 193 countries in the General Assembly. If we would all come together, or most, and you know, there would be only 5 or a few more who are not agreeing, we could basically change many things. But then, of course, it comes to this everyday real politics, what comes on the way, because everybody is in some location, everybody has, you know, some trade partners, everybody has to survive somehow. So this is also very difficult. And in our foreign policy, we are also relying a lot on the digital cooperation. So to have also people's voices heard to technological means, that also means helping women, girls get the better tech education, but overall also because you know, the digital way can be more efficient way of people actually saying what they want, and besides being, of course, great for fighting corruption, as our previous president has said, you cannot bribe a computer. So how would you say, Ingrid, from the Egypt and beyond, how these human rights and all the freedoms are looking, and if there is any hope for some changes overall?
I think hope dies last, and if you talk to people wherever you are, I think then everyone, every single person in the world wants freedoms and wants also human rights to be observed. But the problem is, you know, that what we are facing when cooperating with some countries, that we have our, you know, cultural differences. And this is one on the one hand, and then of course we have the perception problems, you know, because or the different values, be it, you know, on the conservative values, liberal values. And there is the problem that sometimes, you know, the partners in the West, which are criticized, are seen as teachers and preachers, you know, who are going there and trying to kind of impose their way of life and their value system. You understand? So this is actually a very thorny issue, and I don't have a lot of answers to that. But I think we should still go on, keeping our high standards, and of course, human rights is and will be always very, very important. As I said in the beginning, I think wherever you talk to people, for everyone, it's very important. It's just sometimes, the differences are somewhere on the surface, and they can create huge problems between countries. And sometimes, the problems arise when criticism is done openly. For example, many partners globally also say that, listen, we can talk about those issues. They are very, very difficult for us and for our country, but let's do those talks behind closed doors. Please don't go to the UN or Human Rights Council and tell it, to everyone. And then, of course, on the other hand, they also see that we, with our liberal or more liberal values, those actually contradict to their values. So, I don't have good answers, but we should keep dialogue going on, but we should also try to more respect other partners. We should more listen to other people and understand why they are thinking and feeling the way they are doing, and also sometimes, do some kind of small rectification in our own approach. As I said, no teaching and preaching, no one likes it. Did I answer a bit?
Yeah, thank you very much. I will actually come to you now. I think this quiet diplomacy, which is, I think we haven't used it in our, at least in Estonia's foreign policy as actual concrete means, but now also leading this media freedom coalition, previously also with Canada, they said, this quiet diplomacy can work way better in many ways, and of course nobody, wants to be put in a shaming corner. And I think the empathy part, when Estonia was running for the Security Council, we had this slogan, 3 E's, very fit to Estonia. So it was empathy, efficiency, and equality. And that time I was thinking, oh yes, nice. But when I started now thinking more into this, I think it's exactly what we need, and this empathy part for sure. So as from Colombia's point of view, how do you see these developments, especially for rights and freedoms in the world, and whether there are things we could do more, and what Colombia is doing?
Yes, we are as a country convinced of the importance of strengthening human rights on all levels. It's in our constitution, it's in our policies, and we have an active policies for gender equality, for LGBT rights, but also for minorities inside Colombia, but also supporting in the international affairs. So again, we are convinced on that. We work hard to gain the best standards inside, and also in our foreign policy. The gender equality, for example, is active. We have inside our Ministry of Foreign Affairs an office dedicated to guarantee that there is a gender equality, for example, inside even the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But also we think and we believe in the right, talking about human rights of the environment, and to have a healthy environment. So we are big conscious of the importance of keeping it, to straighten it also. We are having in Colombia in October the conference of the COP16, where the 75 ministers of environment have confirmed the attendance there, as well as many NGOs and different delegations from all the world, and where we, as Colombia, are proposing a declaration to, as we call it, make peace with the environment, peace with nature. And that, because also the peace with nature has the implications that through this peace with nature we will gain also some sort of peace between peoples in respect of international law. So that's in our agenda right now.
Thank you. So then thank you also for pointing out the gender equality issue, because as we know in the world, actually all the gender equality issues and women's rights is it's not progressing. It actually, we wouldn't be able to reach the agreements we were able to reach in the 90s now anymore. So human rights agreements are very, very difficult to achieve. So David, coming to you now from this human rights perspective, what you already mentioned also before, and having been at the UN for a long time, and maybe also from the Irish perspective, because you also have been running for the Security Council. So whether, we had this question in Estonia's foreign policy, whether we should balance out some of the possible criticism towards some of the members. We decided to still continue with this value-based, as I'm sure did you. But how you have seen these developments also with the Security Council campaigns, but overall also in the world?
Thanks, Benny. Well, it is obviously a big challenge if you are running for election to the Security Council and you need the votes of 192 other countries. There is the temptation to play down the concerns you might have about human rights issues in different parts of the world. But in doing so, you would be disloyal to your own values. I should say that from my own experience at the UN, there are many different conceptions of human rights, and you'll know this as well. There would be, let's say, broadly the global north view, but when I was negotiating the Sustainable Development Goals, which involve quite an extensive treatment of human rights, all kinds of groups of countries were refusing to accept the language involved. And I don't want to be too specific, but you can imagine that there were many conflicting views about gender equality. There were many conflicting views about what the word family means. There were sometimes quite small terms would turn out to be highly controversial. So it is difficult to find a common denominator across all those. And for a country like Ireland or Estonia, running for election on the basis of its own values, sometimes it means that you're tempted to dilute your own standards in order to get election. I say you're tempted to do that. I think both Estonia and Ireland resisted that temptation, but it is still it's a dilemma. We are all signed up to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but parts of that will be interpreted in different ways, and so there really is no easy answer. Human rights have to be central in everything we do at the UN, but it can easily mean that we lose the votes of many countries for whom human rights are not central. So I wanted just to pick up on a point made earlier about civil society. I think this is a very important point, that civil society, I think, will increasingly be an essential partner for member states like Ireland or Estonia, or indeed Colombia, in their work at the UN. The fact is that we need to have an evidence base for all the decisions we take. We need to show that our policies as governments are backed by evidence, and for that you need the input of civil society in many parts of the world, because they are gathering data which the government itself might not be gathering. So you need to have, apart from the advocacy, you need to have the data input from civil society groups. So, I mean, I don't know with certainty if Estonia did this during its term, but I'm pretty sure you did. When we were on the Security Council, but Ireland was on, we had a lot of so-called ARAS formula meetings. That really means, I'm looking at Lisa here, I'm guessing that Estonia did the same thing, that you would have deliberately arranged civil society meetings on the margins of your Security Council membership in order to bring in that dimension. Well, I think that dimension is actually vital, and frankly, it will come down to the smaller and more progressive countries to take that forward. A last point I want to make is that digitalization and the cyberspace generally is a very good example of an issue that one small country can carve out for itself. Going back to your former president, Ilves, Estonia has been identified with that issue for about the last 10 or 15 years, and it's sometimes difficult for a small country to actually find an issue that it can make its own and for which it can be a strong champion. But we've always admired what Estonia has done on that set of issues. And now we have, for example, the Summit of the Future coming up at the UN in September, where digitalization will be one of the key topics, because we need that in order to achieve sustainable development, in order to combat climate change, in order to achieve health and education outcomes. So you've really picked an issue which is absolutely central for the UN agenda going forward, and my hat off to Estonia for that.
Thank you, David, and also, of course, for mentioning the Summit of the Future, which we haven't had already quite a while of this panel, and we haven't really touched upon. I will come to that because it also has to do with possibly making some changes in the Security Council, as you know, as difficult as they might seem. But Urmas, so how do you see? We talked about those already, this development cooperation and possible values, non-values. So how do you see these things Estonia has identified as good for our country, how we could better spread them elsewhere?
It's still very nice to hear that all what we did like 20 years ago, it is still there. I guess the main issue for us here is that we should not enjoy too long this what we achieved 20 years ago. I guess that, other countries are also moving forward and developing in this regard. So that if we still want to, after 10 years, for instance, to be mentioned as pioneers here and there, then we should, on everyday basis, move forward. And here I see some shortcomings, to put it mildly. So that in this sense, yes, if we like to keep this image, it needs ongoing efforts. And unfortunately, I am a bit critical here. I see that it's not really the case.
So what is the recipe?
The recipe is just not to feel ourselves too convenient. And in this sense, to move forward. Because I also remember nice days, I guess it's already a decade ago, when we had institution called E-Academy, and they were all, faced huge problems that there are so many countries who want to get our experience that they simply have no teachers, they simply have no resources to deliver it. I'm not sure that this is the case today. So that in this sense we should, find ourselves again in this regard. And at the same time, of course, also it's important to, as concretely as possible, of course, also to deliver resources in this regard. Because I also remember with our efforts some funny stories. We were with Estonian business delegation in Indonesia. And I guess we had like 15 Estonian business people in the delegation, and a couple of them were also from some technology companies, especially dealing with surveillance. And we met with Indonesian business counterparts, and it was a very slow meeting, Some people were sleeping, as always, such as sleeping. And then there were representatives of Indonesian police and border guard. And all of a sudden, I recognized that they are very much interested what our technology people are talking about. And then they found themselves very interested in that, this technology what Estonia has gives them better control over their own people, to suppress those who think differently, because there's something new from technological point of view. So that, we of course also have, when we speak about human rights and value-based things, then of course with all these new technologies you also can assist very much all those guys who actually don't care about human rights, or even vice versa, want to suppress them using all these technologies, especially in these days when we have all those so-called dual use yes, stuff and so on, so that people are more clever and clever in this regard. But yes, I'm a bit worried that we should not be in a very foreseeable future another boring small country where the freshest ideas are like 20, 25 years old. So that in this sense, yes, I would urge, push the button in this sense that we should move still forward.
Yeah, no, I think overall e-governance academy is still relevant. I will love to give the floor to Ingrid for this comment, because when I arrived was it in October in Oman, and I was greeted, and the e-governance academy, but I think Nortal, some other companies have done quite a lot of work there and elsewhere. So, but Urmas, you're right. I mean, we probably have been too comfortable with this position. So we have to push ourselves also inside. So how do you see Estonia's value also in this e-governance and different digital solutions fair in the world?
Well, thanks, Minna. I have to tell Urmas that actually in the countries I cover, our fame in e-governance is still very valid. And, maybe it's...
But this fame should go hand in hand with cash, because it always has been an idea, in final end also to sell the product, not just to give it away,
Well, we have been able also to sell the products, and I think from all the countries I cover, Oman is the best example, because I think practically half of Omani e-government is done by Estonians. So we have the fame, and when I was this spring in Lebanon, it was a bit, less turbulent at that time. Then I was told by Prime Minister Mikati to go straight to the public administration minister, because he found out that we had MOU on cooperation in e-governance, and we have not really implemented it and done anything. Of course, Lebanon had revolution and there was COVID coming. There were reasons, but actually I got an order from Prime Minister to go and start doing something. So our fame is there, and of course it does not mean that we need to just rest on the laurel leaves and world moves on.
Rest on Skype.
Yes.
Rest on the image of Skype.
Yeah, but it is there, and it is still our trademark. I still believe in it, but it does not mean that we have to just rest on laurels. We need to work, but also all the good solutions actually come more. I'm more believing in business. Because when it's business to business, business to government, it works better. Because if we do just digital for development cooperation, then it has a bit different meaning. It's very good, it's very, very important, but what works the best usually is when businesses find business partners and start doing things. Thanks.
Thanks. So I actually would like to also open the floor here, or the grass, for some comments or questions, if there are.
Mainly for solutions, of course.
For solutions, actually, that's solution-oriented is the best. If not, then maybe I would pose also one question, David, to you from what I also was asking in the beginning, the perception in Ireland of the UN, because I was always very impressed by how many Irish people or Irish diplomats are working in the UN system overall and doing excellent job. So it looked to me that it's highly regarded as an organization to be. So how do you think that, and maybe also in relation to peacekeeping issues?
Sure, well, first of all, our membership of the UN was the centerpiece of Irish foreign policy from the mid-50s certainly until we joined the EU, and indeed for quite a while after that, because the EU's own foreign policy only kind of gradually developed. So it was really central from 1955 on, when we joined, and at that point we were only about 20 or 30 years into our independence. You know, you can see certain parallels with a country like Estonia. We are a relatively new country and quite small as well. So the UN was central. As to why Irish people have ended up in particular positions at the UN, it's often because we're English speaking. Let's be honest, English is more or less the working language, or it's the first working language of the UN, but it means it's useful in terms of drafting documents and so on. If you are, if you speak English as a native tongue, perhaps, and then we're not Britain, so we're like a small version of the UK. Let's put it like that. I think the fact that we are an outward-looking country, we're a small island, so we have always felt that we needed to be part of a larger gathering. So the EU is psychologically very important for us as well as politically. But in the same way, the UN, we saw the UN as a platform on which we could do some good. We've always had strong relations with Africa, and that partly is a reflection of our history. So the UN gave us a sort of a broader context in which to work, and it still does. That's really all that I can think of. But perhaps the fact that we are seen at the UN occasionally as a kind of an honest broker, that we don't have large commercial interests or indeed large political interests which we are representing. We're not a big power, to put it very mildly. So maybe other countries feel relaxed with us, feel that they can trust us, I hope. On peacekeeping, for much the same reason, that Irish soldiers were involved in peacekeeping every day since we joined the UN in 1955. We've mainly been involved in South Lebanon, also on the Golan Heights, and in various parts of Africa. To be honest, and to be cynical about it, it always helped to pay bills for the Irish Defence Forces that the UN was willing to subsidise us. I mean, that's a cynical view, but the truth is that in a more idealistic way, we wanted to make a difference and play our part in international peace and security. We're not in NATO. I think it's unlikely that we will join NATO. So we're not a member of any military alliance. That is a reflection of our history. It's not a reflection. It doesn't have to do with ideological neutrality. It's because of issues we had with the UK for a long time. But because we're not in NATO, we like to feel that we can make a contribution to peace and security in another way. So that's a further explanation for our peacekeeping involvement.
I saw very...
No, I just want to, sorry, but 3 years ago, Swedish ambassador said the same about NATO.
Yeah, well, they've gone in, we haven't.
Yeah, but I mean, I honestly think that you have done a lot, and also, as said, the language can also be very helpful in drafting exercises in other ways. So maybe, as said, coming back to you also from the UN sense and where it's going, the divides are very big. We see it. We started talking about it also now in the beginning, that some feel that they are not listened, the others feel that they are not listened in another way, and we see it a lot now in this, for example, in the Gaza votes, for example, from the EU perspective, when we have 3 different ways of voting there. So in that sense, that is one, we see it from here. But what do you think would be yours or Latin America at large a recipe for making these divides smaller? What would be the things that one needs to emphasize more? That is in relation to what David mentioned, this Pact of the Future, which will now be adopted in September. And in all my honest opinion, also being optimist about the UN, I don't think it's going to make a big difference, because it is even now already not very ambitious, and I think the ambition even might go down in one or other ways. So how do you see that?
Well, that's a
Easy question.
with probably no answer. But first of all, because probably there is not only one perspective, one voice in Latin America. When you say Latin America, there are different views. You know? And Brazil,
Colombia then.
Exactly, Brazil must have some vision of Colombia, and some other, Colombia, Mexico, they may have another view, but in our view, it's just to keep working to try to actually have the voice of our countries listen in a better way. I think we have things to say in the UN, and we have already have some experience, of course, in the Security Council, etc. But keep working on that. But if you allow me, what I wanted to do is to have a short comment on e-governance. You were talking in Estonia, and we recognize on that because it's one of the topics, actually, one of the subjects we're working with Colombia and Estonia, exploring ways of to work together in the future for this matter, and also cybersecurity, which you are very strong. So I see there a big, important, clear possibility of working together, Estonia and Colombia. We are already having it, but we need to concrete things on this matter.
That's good to hear.
And please, representatives of Estonian government,
Yes.
you should push also with our European brothers finally to implement EU-Mercosur agreement. When we speak also about connections with Latin America and then European influence in Latin America and vice versa.
The good news is that there is an Colombia-UE free trade agreement. So.
At least this one, yes, this is already a big thing.
I don't see any colleagues at the moment here who can address it to, so I will take it on
you as
I
high
understand.
representative of Estonian government, do your job.
I understood. I will try to do my job next as well. But so I think we can, if there are no comments or questions, I see some people very much interestingly nodding on many places. So if anybody has a comment, it doesn't have to be a question. It's also very welcome. But if not, then I think, oh, please. Yes, you see? We had to wait just a bit.
Hi, my name is Alina. I'm originally from Ukraine, but living in Canada now. I guess my question would be about Russia and legitimacy of Russia being in UN, as it never was voted originally, and it was kind of leftover Soviet Union. And while Soviet Union was basically extension of Russian Empire, and Estonia also was in Soviet Union. So why all of those countries haven't become automatically a member, but yet Russia become a member, and we never kind of address it?
Thank you. Maybe I will make the first go because we've looked into this extensively, and I'm sure colleagues can come in. We have really left no stone unturned to see whether it is something we can do, because there is a legitimacy issue, and not only that, it's as I said in the beginning, it is a very, very schizophrenic situation where you have that country who is there to uphold this peace and security actually starting it all. So that I think, and I must say, in my consultations with many of the UN members now, also I was a few weeks ago in New York, a few weeks ago also in Geneva, it is not very much understood that this is a problem. And of course, we have many historic problems where somebody has felt that they haven't been listened to. So this comes down, of course, to actually Russia having to agree to any kind of solution. So this is where it comes from. And I think the General Assembly empowerment, where you have 193 countries, that's what I've also been now talking with the Ukrainian representatives, because President Zelensky has asked Estonia also to lead one of these working groups. It's on UN Charter, Territorial Integrity, a rules-based world order. So we are now looking into this, but even with my huge positive attitude towards the UN and abilities, because I saw it also previously. Estonia was in charge of how reforming how the Secretary General of the UN is selected. For 70 years, it was Russia and the US who agreed who is the next Secretary General, and then it was everybody else was let know, and the General Assembly was rubber stamping. In my view, it could be also in this case that when you have the atrocities going on, that the General Assembly could take it more into our own hands. And now we are looking with other like-minded countries into this. But no quick solutions. I mean, if there would be, they would have been done. So I don't know. Urmas, comment.
Well, there is very, I would not say nice, but still German word called realpolitik.
Yeah.
This is the answer. That's it.
Well, I tried to explain it in a more... David.
I mean, I don't have anything to add on the kind of the legal point, but I'm fascinated by it and also by what Minna just said. I've never had an occasion to sort of study it, but I just wanted to mention one thing, and you probably know this, that since the Ukraine war the invasion started, that a country which uses a veto at the Security Council is required now to come and explain in the General Assembly why it used the veto. Now, you could argue that that's doesn't amount to very much, but it is a small step in the direction of greater accountability on the part of the Security Council members to the wider membership. It means that there's a slight degree of embarrassment for Russia, let's call a spade, that it has to come to the Security Council to explain why it used a veto on a particular issue. This is not the question you raised, but I'm reminded that in fact the General Assembly is trying to bring the Security Council a bit more under control. It has a much longer distance to travel, but efforts need to be made to weaken the authority of the 5 permanent members. On what Minna said about the election of Secretary General, I mean, I was there the last time round in 2016, and effectively it came down to the 5 permanent P5 members, the permanent members, deciding among themselves. And I mean, I'm not telling any big secret here, but the present man, Guterres, he was always likely to be supported by the US and the UK. The key thing was Russia. Russia eventually decided that it preferred Guterres to some of the other candidates being mentioned, and I won't go into exactly which ones, but Russia decided that its best interests were served by Guterres, and once Russia decided, I think China were also on board. So it came down to the P5, even though that was never formally mentioned, but that's how the rest of us understood it. Incidentally, the various candidates for the post last time around did a kind of beauty contest, as I would call it. They talked to large groups of members to present their case, but it really, and that was a novelty. It hadn't happened before, but it did come down effectively to agreement being reached among the 5.
Thanks. Before giving floor to Urmas, who wanted to make a comment, I just will comment on this one more time, because that was the General Assembly, the countries who thought, oh, this is also our Secretary General, so maybe we should know also who the candidates are. It seemed like a huge development, which shouldn't be. And then we were able also to have hearings, to ask questions, what is your policy? So I'm saying there are ways, and that's what I'm saying, if enough countries that time, I was leading one of these groups, this ACT group, Ireland is also a member, to try to persuade others, and the others were yes, of course. And of course, there were many who were saying that it should be a woman, and maybe next time it is, and so on. So many different groups, but we were all for the same thing. We would like to know. So in that relation, that is also that there is a power which we are not using because we think that nobody's gonna anyway support it. But Urmas, please.
Well, I a little bit spoiled the party again, I guess, because I continue where I stopped. I mentioned this realpolitik. And I guess that it's obvious that any political organization works mainly on the basis of political will. Yes, in international, system in the UN, we have lots of elements of international law and so on and so on. But in final end, the things only happen if there is political will. Because we have seen during last decade so many avoidances or breaking the international law and nothing happens. Because if you think there is actually for serious violations of international law, for human rights on the UN level, there is only actually one body. And this body is very weak and on voluntary basis. This is International Criminal Court. Actually the only body who can work to avoid impunity and to really handle, the biggest atrocities which are happening all around the world. But still, lots of countries are not members. Also the same Russia-Ukraine case. The court wants to have Putin and others in front of the court, but what is happening? Putin is, he is not traveling to everywhere, but still meeting proudly with other UN Security Council member leaders in China or some others and so on and so on. So that actually those legal instruments, global legal instruments are very, very weak because there is no real political will to build them up and to implement all of this. And it also applies for, of course, UN's everyday business. We diplomats and officials, of course, can be very happy that, now we changed little bit, step by step, the system, how we can get new Secretary General. But in large picture, is there any difference who is the Secretary General of UN if the big picture, the general picture with permanent members of UN Security Council, of the absence of political will to cooperate between authoritarian and democratic huge regimes is there. So that, of course, it's sort of tricky, the small things, but in big picture, they actually are not making any difference. And the difference will be not there as long as there is no real political will. That's it. And this is this realpolitik.
It is. The political will, actually, this is the hindrance in many cases, but empowering the Secretary General, if that person feels empowered by a large number of the General Assembly, it can make a difference. So since we are almost running out of time, I would just now like to give the floor if anybody wants to make some last remarks here, which was not said or what I didn't ask. Ingrid? Conclusion.
Conclusion. Well, there is always hope, and yes, if we talk about UN, then let's not only see the glass which is half empty, but see also the half full picture. So we still have good things. We still, have parts of UN that function. About Security Council, I agree totally. About the more empowerment for the General Assembly, yes, this should do the trick if we find a way how to do it, because most of the countries there are small ones. So actually we are majority. So let's find some kind of some kind of momentum. To start the process or new conversations, because let's deal with the things that don't function but not break the ones that do.
True. Thank you. Asad, please, your final words.
Thank you. I think that no matter how imperfect the UN system and the international system is better than not having any system. Colombia bet for the multilateralism. We are convinced of the multilateralism, and small and medium countries are probably, in spite of everything we have said here, that the more beneficiaries of this system. So let's keep straightening it. Let's keep working for the gaining more and more legitimacy, but let's bet for that.
Thanks. I see the sun has also brought out the optimism in this panel. Let's then see what Urmas thinks. But David, what is your final word?
Really, just to repeat the point I made, that it is possible every now and again that the UN will produce a consensus on big global challenges. And that's very encouraging when it happens. In the year 2015, we had 4 big agreements. It was called with some exaggeration, Annus Mirabilis, the year of wonders. That's only a few years ago. So in the last few years, the clouds have darkened a bit, but it doesn't mean that the sun won't come out again. Forgive me for getting lyrical at this stage of the evening. Thanks to you, by the way. You covered absolutely everything. You were a fantastic moderator, and
Thanks,
I have nothing to add. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks. Urmas, please, some optimism.
Okay.
But short.
No, yes. First, I actually don't like when you're talking about small countries. Ireland is not small country. Estonia is also not small country. Ireland and Estonia, we are compact countries, not small countries. And hope is, I agree, hope is always there, because you should recall that 1343, on the same spot here in Paide, on this hill, 4 Estonian kings were killed and murdered. And now we are here again, back. Hope is always
Only
there.
a few years later.
Let's hope
It's positive enough. But thank you so much, dear panelists. Very, very good. Thank you for this audience here, who, despite all the natural circumstances, were able to follow through. And thank you to my colleagues also in the foreign ministry, who have been in charge of this foreign ministry, foreign policy area, and of course everybody who has chipped into this opinion festival being a great one once again. So thank you all. Have a good night.